Nobody tells you that you can see a person's whole face for 1 second and just know. I was 11 steps into the aisle. I counted them later, off the videographer's raw footage, because I needed to know exactly when it happened, and it was 11. My dad had my arm. Not holding it. Hanging off it, more like, because by then he was down to about 140 pounds, and that walk from the door to the altar was the longest thing he'd done in 6 months. The organ lady was playing the Pachelbel thing everybody plays. The one you hear and immediately picture somebody else's wedding. And I looked back. I don't know why. There's no reason on earth to look back at your own wedding. The aisle points one direction. That's the whole design of it. But I turned my head to the left, toward the back corner by the coat rack, and there was a woman standing in the last row. Gray coat, buttoned all the way up, in June. She wasn't sitting. Everybody else was sitting. And before I say the next part, I want you to understand something, because I know how it sounds. I'm not a spiritual person. I don't believe in signs. I have never once in my life said the word energy about a room. But I looked at that woman and my knees did something. She had my face. Not a face like mine. Mine. The same heavy eyebrows I've been paying somebody $30 a month to deal with since I was 19. The same gap between the two front teeth, and I could see it because she was crying with her mouth open, the ugly way, the way you cry when you've held it a long time, and it finally gets away from you. My mother told me that woman died in 1994. Overdose in a motel off 75 outside Dayton. She told me when I was 6, and again when I was 11, and again when I was 22 at the kitchen table, and it was the same 8 words every single time, like she'd rehearsed them in a mirror. That woman was standing 40 feet behind my mother, and my mother never turned around. Not through the vows, not through the ring, not through the part where the pastor says you may kiss. That's how I knew she already knew. So let me back all the way up. The wedding isn't the story. The wedding is just the day the story finally came up for air. And for any of what I did after to make sense, I have to take you to a house on Delmar Avenue, and to a woman who loved me so hard she broke the law to keep me. The house on Delmar had 4 bedrooms and one of them was locked. I want to start there because it's the most honest thing I can tell you about my childhood. It wasn't a dungeon. Nobody hurt me. I had a purple bike. I had swim lessons at the Y. I had a mother who showed up 90 minutes early to every single school event in my entire life so she could get the seat on the aisle. And there was one room at the end of the hall that stayed locked, and I never asked why, and I want you to sit with how strange that is. A kid doesn't ask. A kid just absorbs the shape of the house and calls it normal. Her name is Diane. My mom. I still call her Mom, and I've thought about whether I should stop, and I haven't stopped. She was a school nurse for 31 years at Fairview Elementary, and if you've ever met a school nurse, you already know exactly who she is. Competent. Fast. The kind of person who has a Band-Aid in her purse in 2003, and also in 2019. She kept a laminated card in the glove box with our blood types on it. Mine's O positive. I know that fact the way other people know their own phone number, because she made me memorize it when I was 7 in case, and she never finished the sentence. In case what? The story I got about where I came from was 4 sentences long. I could recite it before I could ride a bike. Your birth mother was very young. She had a problem with drugs. She loved you enough to let you go. She passed away when you were 2. 4 sentences. And then a hand on my head, and then something about dinner. I asked follow-up questions exactly twice as a small child. The first time I was maybe 5, and I asked what her name was, and my mother said, "Honey, we don't have that," and went to fold towels. There were no towels that needed folding. I remember standing in the hallway looking at the linen closet door and understanding, at 5 years old, with no words for it, that I had done something wrong. The second time I was 8. I asked if I looked like her. My mother put down a coffee cup very carefully, the way you set something down when you don't trust your hand, and she said, "You look like yourself." That was it. That was the whole answer. And here's the thing that took me 30 years to see. She never yelled. She never said, "Don't ask me that." She was never cruel. Not one time. And that's exactly why it worked. Cruelty a kid can push against. Sadness a kid protects. I learned that asking about the woman who had me made my mother sad. And I loved my mother, so I stopped. My dad was named Ray. He sold commercial flooring for a company out of Springfield, and he was gone Tuesday through Thursday most weeks. He had a laugh that came about a half-second late, like he was checking with somebody first. In 25 years of that house, I do not think I ever heard him contradict Diane out loud. He'd contradict her sideways. She'd say no more cereal, and an hour later there'd be a bowl of cereal on the counter and him not in the room. And then there were the cards. Every April, a card came. Not for my birthday. My birthday's in November. April, and always the second week, and always a plain card from a drugstore rack with a bird or a bridge on the front. No return address. Postmarked Cincinnati, which meant nothing to me, because Cincinnati was just a place on the weather map. Inside, the same handwriting every year. Small, tight, leaning hard to the right. Thinking of you this month, a friend of your mother's. That's all it ever said. 9 words and a friend of your mother's, and I read that as a friend of Diane's, because what else would a child read it as? I remember one year I asked which friend. My mother took the card out of my hands, and she looked at it for a long time, longer than 9 words takes, and she said someone from a long time ago. She kept them. Every one. I found that out later. I was 34 years old before I understood what April was. April was the month I was born, if you counted from the wrong end. April was when a woman found out she was pregnant. I didn't know that then. Then I just liked the birds. I got sick when I was 12. Nothing serious, a strep thing that went sideways for about a week, and a doctor at the urgent care on Bardwell asked my mother the most ordinary question in the world. Any family history of autoimmune on either side? And my mother said no. Not. We don't know. Not. She's adopted. No. Flat. Certain. And I was sitting on the paper on the table with my legs hanging, and I turned and looked at her, and she did not look at me, and something in my chest went cold in a way I couldn't explain to myself for another 2 decades. That's the first time I understood that my mother could lie in front of me. Not to me. In front of me. With me right there as the evidence. I got weird about it after that. Not dramatic. I was a good kid, honor roll, no piercings, the whole thing. But I started looking. There's a specific kind of searching a teenager does when she can't ask. You go through drawers when nobody's home. You do it slow and you put everything back at the exact angle. I was extremely good at it. I could tell you the contents of every drawer in that house by the time I was 15. And I never found a single thing, because the file cabinet in the locked room was locked too. And I wasn't going to pick a lock, because picking a lock is a thing you do to a stranger, and I still wanted to be a good daughter. The one time I pushed, I was 17. We were in the car. That's where you do it. In the car she can't leave, and she has to keep her eyes on the road. We were on 4 coming back from my cousin's graduation party, and I said, I want her name. And my mother said, whose? And I said, don't do that. I'd never said anything like that to her in my life. My hands were shaking. I had rehearsed it for 11 days. She drove for maybe 2 miles without saying anything. Big trucks going by. And then she said, in a completely normal voice, the voice you'd use to ask if I wanted the radio on, she said, Claire, she is not a mystery. She's a sad story. And I have spent your entire life making sure the sad story is not your story. Do you understand what I'm doing for you? And I said yes. I want to be honest here because I've had a long time to think about it. I said yes and I meant it. In that moment I believed her completely. Not because she was convincing. Because she was my mother and she was crying without making any noise about it. Just water going down, hands at 10 and 2. And I would have said yes to anything to make that stop. That's the thing nobody warns you about a controlling parent who's also a loving one. You don't get to be the hero of the story. You participate. You help. We never talked about it again. 15 years. Not once. My dad, though. About a month after that car ride, he came into the kitchen when I was doing homework. He got a glass of water he didn't drink. He stood at the sink with his back to me, and he said, Your mother's not a liar. I said, okay. He said, "She's a scared person. There's a difference, and it's not a big one, but there's a difference." And then he said something I've turned over probably 1,000 times since. He said, "If you ever want to know something, you ask me twice. Once so I know you mean it, and once when she's not in the house." I never did. I never asked him even once. I moved out at 19. Went to Wright State, came back for holidays, got a job doing medical billing for an orthopedic group and stayed in it 11 years because it was fine and I am, apparently, a person who tolerates fine for a long time. And every April, a card came to Delmar Avenue. My mother would mention it on the phone in this offhand way. "Oh, that card came again." And I'd say, "Huh?" And we'd move on to whether she should get the gutters done. 9 words a year for 31 years, and neither of us ever said the obvious thing out loud, which is that somebody was still alive out there and counting. I met Mark at a work thing I didn't want to go to. He was the rep for the imaging software, and he gave a 40-minute presentation with a typo on the second slide that he never noticed. And I liked that about him immediately. He's calm in a way I find almost suspicious. He's from a family of 6 from Toledo, where everybody yells and nobody means it, which is the exact opposite of a house where nobody yells and everybody means it. We dated 3 years. He proposed in the parking lot of a Kroger, which sounds bad and wasn't, and the first thing I did after I said yes was call my mother, and the first thing she said was, "Oh, thank God." Not congratulations. Oh, thank God. 2 months later, my dad got his diagnosis. Pancreatic, stage 3, the kind where the doctor says numbers with a lot of ifs in them. He was 69. He'd retired 8 months earlier and had bought a boat he took out twice. And that's when the wedding stopped being a wedding and became a deadline. Nobody said it that way. Everybody knew. We moved it up from the following spring to June. My mother took over almost the entire thing, which I let happen, because she needed something to hold on to and because honestly I didn't care that much about linens. But there was one fight. One. The guest list. She wanted 140 people. I wanted 60. And we went back and forth on it for weeks, and at some point I said something like, "It's my wedding," and she got very quiet and said, "It's the last big thing your father sees." So we did 140. And she did the invitations herself. Sat at that dining room table with a calligraphy pen she bought specifically, doing them by hand over about 9 evenings, and she made a spreadsheet, because of course she did. Column for name. Column for address. Column for mailed. Column for RSVP. I saw that spreadsheet. I helped with the addresses for my side. There were 142 rows, and I knew every name on it. My dad addressed exactly 1 envelope. I know that now. I didn't know it then. I found out in September, sitting in a hospice room, and he told me like a man confessing to a much smaller crime. But in June, all I knew was that the week before the wedding, he was having a good stretch. He'd gotten some strength back. He wanted to walk me down, and everybody said it was a bad idea, and he did it anyway. The rehearsal dinner was at a place on Main that does family style. And there was a moment, and I keep coming back to it, where my dad tapped his glass and stood up, and he was maybe 4 sentences into a toast when he stopped and just looked at me and said, "I'm glad everyone's coming." Everyone. He sat down. My mother put her hand on his back, and I thought he was tired. Here's what I know about that week now. My dad, who had never once contradicted his wife in front of another human being in 41 years of marriage, got in his car on a Tuesday in April when Diane was at a dentist appointment, and he drove to the post office on Woodman, and he mailed a wedding invitation to an address he had kept written down somewhere for over 3 decades. He didn't tell me. He didn't tell my mother. He didn't tell the woman he sent it to what she'd be walking into, and he didn't ask if she'd come. And 142 people RSVP'd, and my mother's spreadsheet said 138 yes, and there were 139 people in that church. I've asked myself if he was being brave or if he was being a coward one last time, doing it sideways, the way he put the cereal on the counter and left the room. Both, probably. People are usually both. The night before the wedding I slept at my mother's house, in my old room, which she had not changed. Same purple walls. Same water stain on the ceiling shaped like Michigan. She came in at 11 and sat on the end of the bed and told me she was proud of me. And then she said, tomorrow's going to be a lot. And whatever happens, I did everything for a reason. I said, Mom, it's a wedding. And she said, I know. Go to sleep. Here's what the rest of that ceremony was like from inside my own head. I do not remember my vows. I've watched them. I said them. They're fine. I sound like a normal person saying normal things. I have no memory of it. What I remember is doing arithmetic. Standing at an altar in a $900 dress doing math about a motel outside Dayton in 1994. Because there are only two options, right? Either my mother was wrong, or my mother was lying. And my mother has never been wrong about a factual matter in her entire life. She's the woman with the blood types in the glove box. I remember thinking, very clearly, don't turn around again. Because if she's gone, you're crazy. And if she's still there, everything is over. I made it through the kiss. I made it through the recessional, which is the part where you walk back up the aisle, which meant walking directly at her, and I was looking at the back of that church so hard my eyes hurt. The last row was empty. The coat rack, the door, nothing. And I did the thing every woman in that situation does, which is smile at 200 cameras for 45 minutes, while my whole body ran a fever. The reception was at a hall out on Little York. There was a chicken option and a beef option. My cousin got drunk and did the worm. Twice during that night I went out to the parking lot alone. I don't know what I thought I'd find. A gray coat under a light pole, I guess. At about 9:30, I got my mother alone by the cake table, and I asked her. I said, was there a woman in the back of the church? And I watched her face do the whole thing. There was a full second of nothing, which is the tell, because Diane doesn't have blank seconds. Then a small laugh. Then she said, honey, there were 140 people in the back of the church. I said, in a gray coat. Standing. And she said, I didn't turn around, I was watching you. That's what she said. I didn't turn around, I was watching you. And it's not even a lie. That's what makes it so good. Every word of it is true. It just isn't an answer. I let it go. I want you to know that I let it go, at my own wedding, with my father in a chair by the wall who wasn't going to see Christmas, and I put it in a box, and I danced to a Van Morrison song. 2 things happened after that night that I need to tell you in order. The first is the photographer's gallery. It came back 11 days later, 410 images in an online folder with a password. Mark and I went through it on a laptop in bed like everybody does. Image 114. Processional. Wide shot from the balcony. Back left, past the last pew, half behind a pillar. Out of focus, because the focus is on me. A woman standing. Gray coat. You can't see her face. The resolution's not there. You can see she's standing when everyone else is seated, and you can see her hands are up near her chin. I zoomed in until it was just squares. I did that for probably an hour. Mark fell asleep. I wasn't crazy. The second thing happened in August. My dad went into hospice on the 9th. The house on Delmar had to get sorted because my mother was going to move to something smaller after. And there was a basement full of 35 years of paper. And I said I'd do it because I wanted a job that wasn't sitting in a room watching a man breathe. So on a Saturday, alone in a basement, I started opening file boxes. Tax returns, warranties for appliances that didn't exist anymore. My report cards, all of them in order. A box of every card I ever made her out of construction paper. And behind the water heater, on the bottom shelf, a banker's box with a lid taped on. The tape was old. It had gone yellow and brittle, and it came off in one piece. On the side of the box, in my mother's handwriting, in marker, it said house. There was nothing in it about the house. The first thing on top was the check register. Not a bank statement. An actual paper register, the kind that comes in the box of checks. And there were 41 of them rubber banded in bundles of about 10. And I opened the top one and the top line was from March, that year. 4 months before my wedding. Arvance. 200.00. And the line above it, February, R. Vance, 200.00. January, R. Vance, 200.00. I sat down on the concrete floor. I went backward. Every month, $200. Going back through 2019, 2011, 2004. The amount changed as I went back. In the 90s it was $125. In the 80s it was $75. The oldest one was in a register with a cover so faded I had to hold it at the light. November 1991. R. Vance. $75.00. I was born in November of 1991. There was a legal-size envelope underneath the registers. Inside it were 31 carbon copies of a one-page document, one for each year, and every one of them said the same thing at the top. Agreement and release. I read maybe 40% of it. My eyes wouldn't do the lines in order. But I got the shape of it, and the shape of it was that a party referred to as the natural mother agreed, in exchange for consideration, to permanently and completely waive, and there was a long list of things she waived: contact, visitation, communication, identification, the whole architecture of a person. And there was a name typed on a line at the bottom, above the word mother. Ruth Ann Vance. I said it out loud in that basement, not on purpose. It just came out of me. I want to tell you what I decided in the next 90 seconds, because it was wrong, and because I think anybody would have decided the same thing. I decided my mother bought me. I decided that a 19 or 20-year-old girl in Ohio in 1991 signed her daughter away for $75 a month, and then cashed a check every month for 31 years, through my first steps, through my confirmation, through my college graduation, through my engagement, through my wedding, and showed up at the church to look at the merchandise. That's the sentence I had. Look at the merchandise. That's how ugly I got, sitting on the floor down there, and I'm not going to clean it up for you. Because here's what it explained. It explained the April cards, 9 words a year, a friend of your mother's, which suddenly read as a woman who couldn't even sign her own name to it. It explained the locked room. It explained why the story had to be 4 sentences, and why one of those sentences had to be that she was dead. Because a dead woman doesn't have an address, and doesn't have a bank account, and doesn't have anything you can go looking for. And it explained my mother in a way that felt, right then, like relief. Like finally having a diagnosis. She wasn't scared. She was a person who wrote a check every month for 31 years, and never missed one. Not one. Not in the month my dad got laid off in 2009. Not in the month she had her gallbladder out. That is not fear. That's a payment plan. I took the box. I put it in my trunk. I drove home and I didn't tell Mark for 2 days, which is the longest I have ever kept anything from him. When I finally did, at the kitchen counter, I laid it all out and I said, "My mother paid a woman to disappear." And Mark looked at it for a while and he said, "Or?" I said, "Or what?" He said, "I don't know. Or something. That's a lot of paperwork for a bribe." I got very angry at him. We had our first real fight as married people, over a box, and I said things about him not understanding because his family is normal, and he took it, which made it worse. But he was right, and I knew he was right about 10 minutes into being furious with him, because of one thing. You don't hire a lawyer to draw up an agreement and release, and renew it every year for 3 decades if the other person is doing what you want. You do that if she isn't. Ruth Ann Vance was not hard to find. That's the part that still gets me. 9 minutes. I want you to hear that. My entire life. The great unknowable tragedy. The sad story. The thing I was protected from. And it took 9 minutes on a laptop at my own kitchen table. There were 3 of them in Ohio. One was in her 80s in Toledo. One was 26. And one was 53 years old with an address in Green Township on the west side of Cincinnati. 41 minutes from the house on Delmar. I put it in the map because I didn't believe it. 41 minutes with no traffic. She'd lived at that address for 19 years. Before that, 2 others, both in Hamilton County. She had never left. My whole life, she was closer to me than my orthodontist. I want to say I thought hard about what to do next. I didn't. I sat in that chair for maybe 4 hours doing nothing, and then I got in the car on a Thursday morning without telling my husband, and I drove down 75 with my hands sweating on the wheel, and about 20 minutes and I started laughing. Out loud. Alone in a car, because it occurred to me that this was the same highway as the motel. The building was a 4-unit off a street with no sidewalk. Vinyl siding, gray, which I noticed. 2 plastic chairs outside the downstairs door and a coffee can with cigarette butts in it and a hose coiled up perfectly. I sat in that parking lot for 1 hour and 10 minutes. Around noon a woman came out of the downstairs unit in scrubs. Purple ones. And it was her, and she got in a Corolla and drove away and I did not move, and I want to be honest about why. It wasn't fear. It was that she looked completely fine. She looked like a woman going to work. And I had driven 41 minutes, carrying a box in my trunk with a sentence in it about buying a child, and she looked like a person with a shift. I came back the next Thursday, and the one after that. The third time, she was sitting in one of the plastic chairs when I pulled in. She stood up before I turned the car off. She knew the car. That's the thing. She didn't know me from a stranger at that distance, at 53, at whatever her eyes are. She knew the car, because it turns out I had parked in the same spot 3 times, and she'd been watching that lot for a week wondering if she was losing her mind. I got out. I didn't have anything planned, not a word. And she said, "Hi?" Just hi. Like a neighbor. Then she said, "Do you want to come in? And I need you to know I've got nothing in there. There's no coffee. I drink it at work." We sat in a living room with a couch and a recliner, and a TV that wasn't on. There was a framed picture of 2 boys on top of a bookshelf, and I made myself not look at it for the first 10 minutes. She said, "You got married." I said, "You were there." She said, "I was in the back." And then neither of us said anything for what felt like a full minute and probably was, and I remember hearing the refrigerator. I asked her the only question I had. I said, "Why did you take the money?" And she stopped. Her whole face changed, and not into hurt. Into confusion. Genuine, uncomplicated confusion. The way your face goes when somebody tells you your car's on fire. She said, "What money?" I said $200 a month, for 31 years. And Ruth Ann Vance sat back in that recliner, and she put both hands flat on her knees, and she said, "Oh." And then she said, "I want to show you something. It's in the closet. It's gonna take me a minute because it's heavy." It was a plastic tote. The kind you buy at a hardware store for like $8, with the yellow lid that snaps. She dragged it out with both hands and pushed it across the carpet with her foot, and she said, "I've moved 4 times with this thing, and every time I think about throwing it out." She took the lid off. Envelopes, hundreds of them, unopened, most of them, sorted by year with rubber bands, the same as my mother's registers, which is a thing I noticed and hated noticing. She picked one up at random and turned it over so I could see the flap was sealed, and she said, "I opened the first 6. Then I stopped opening them." I said, "Why?" And she said, "Because it was $200, and if I opened it I'd spend it, and if I spent it then it was a deal." I've thought about that sentence more than almost any sentence anyone has ever said to me. Then she told me the actual story, and I'm going to give it to you the way she gave it to me, which was flat, no music in it, like a woman reading off a chart. She was 20 when she had me. She was using. She's not soft about that part, and she doesn't want it softened. Her mother put her in a car and drove her to a lawyer's office, and there were papers and she signed them. And she says she remembers the pen was one of those with a chain on it, and she does not remember reading anything. 10 weeks later she got clean. Not permanently, but that time she got 70 days. And at 7 months, when I was 7 months old, Ruth Ann Vance filed to reverse the adoption. She had a public defender's referral and a guy who did family law out of a strip mall in Fairfield, and she had 70 days sober and a job at a big boy in her mother's spare room. And my mother had a lawyer named Feldman out of downtown Dayton. It went 11 months. 11 months for a case that Ruth says her own lawyer told her at month 2 she was probably going to lose. There were filings, and there were continuances, and there was a psychological evaluation, and there was a motion about her records from a treatment center in 1990, and there was a deposition where they asked her, and she told me this part looking at the carpet, where they asked her to list every man she had been with in the year I was conceived, in order, with last names, and her lawyer objected, and the objection didn't go anywhere. She lasted 11 months. She said, I didn't lose, I ran out. And when it was over, Feldman's office sent an agreement. Waive everything, permanently, and in exchange there'd be a monthly consideration, and she said her lawyer told her to take it, because it was the only thing on the table. She said, I thought it was so I wouldn't come back. She looked at that tote, and she said, I think it was so she could sleep. Then she said the thing that took the floor out from under me. She said, the checks weren't the deal. The deal was I couldn't contact you. The checks were extra. Nobody made her send those. She just did. 31 years. $200 a month into a mailbox belonging to a woman who never once cashed one. And my mother knew that, because you know when your checks don't clear. My mother sat in a house on Delmar Avenue writing a check every month to a woman she knew wasn't cashing them. I said, why would she do that? And Ruth said, because you can't apologize to somebody you've told your kid is dead. I asked about the April cards. She said yes. She said she picked April because the agreement said no contact with the child, and she'd decided a card with no name on it, sent to the mother's address, wasn't contact with the child. She said she knew that was a lie she was telling herself, and she sent them anyway. 31 cards. 9 words. And every year, one of us kept it. I drove to Delmar Avenue the next morning with the banker's box on the passenger seat. I had a whole thing prepared. I'd said it out loud in the car 3 times. It had the word deposition in it. She was at the sink. She's always at the sink. She'd been at hospice until 9 the night before, and she looked it. And she said, there's coffee, and I put the box on the kitchen table, and I didn't say anything. She looked at the box. And she said, okay. Not what's that. Not where did you get that. Okay. Like a woman who'd been waiting 34 years for a box to appear on a table. I said, she's alive. She said, I know. I said, she was in the church. She said, I know. And I said, you told me she was dead, and I want you to say out loud that you told me she was dead. And my mother turned around and dried her hands on a towel, and she said, I told you she was dead. I don't know what I expected. Denial, probably. It's so much easier when they deny it. I started going through the papers. I was doing it loud, slapping them down, the registers, the release, and I got to the part about the deposition, and I said, you asked a 21-year-old girl to list men in front of a court reporter, and she said, my lawyer did. I said, that's the same thing. And she said, yes, it is. Everything I had was built for a fight, and she wouldn't give me one. And that's when I actually started screaming. I said, she got clean. She got clean, and she came for me, and you buried her in paper until she couldn't afford to want me anymore. And my mother sat down. She said, I had 2 before you. I said, what? She said, a boy at 22 weeks in 1986, and a girl at 17 weeks in 1989. Neither of them has a headstone because your father didn't think we could take doing that twice. She said they had names. I'm not going to tell you what they were. And she said, when they put you in my arms, you were 3 days old, and you had a scratch on your cheek from your own hand, and a woman from the county told me it was final. And I understood the word final differently than other people understand it. She said, when the papers came at 7 months, I did not think about her one time. Not once. I'm telling you that so you know exactly what I am. I thought about the 2 before you. And I picked up the phone, and I called a man, and I said, I don't care what it costs. She said, and it worked. And I have known every day since that it worked because I could afford it, and she couldn't. And that's all it was. I said, then why the money? And my mother said, because I couldn't stop. She said, the first one I mailed in November, and it was $75, and I don't know what I thought it was. And she never cashed it. And I knew by January she was never going to cash any of them, and I kept sending them for 31 years. And I want you to know I sent one this month too. I said, that's not an apology. That's a bill you paid yourself. And she said, I know exactly what it is. My dad died on the 11th of September, and 8 days before he did, with my mother down at the vending machines, he told me about the envelope. He said he wrote it out at the kitchen table on a Tuesday and drove it to the post office on Woodman. He said, I didn't know if she'd come. I said, why? And he took a long time, because everything took him a long time by then. And he said, because your mother made one decision when you were a baby, and then spent her whole life defending it, and I stood there and let her do it alone. He said, I wasn't fixing it. I just didn't want to be the last person who knew. The funeral was small. Ruth wasn't there. I didn't ask her and she didn't ask me. 6 weeks later, I did something I still can't fully explain. I drove my mother to Green Township. I told her that morning, in the car, on the highway, because I knew if I told her in the house, she wouldn't get in the car. She didn't say a word for 41 minutes. The two of them sat in that living room, my mother on the couch with her purse still on her shoulder, Ruth in the recliner in her purple scrubs because she had a shift at 3. It was not a movie. Nobody cried. There was no hug. My mother said, I want to say something, and I want to say it wrong, because if I get it right it'll sound like I practiced. And Ruth said, okay. And my mother said, I did it on purpose. All of it. And I'd do it again, and I've never once been able to figure out how both of those can be true. Ruth looked at her for a while. And then she said, I know how they're both true. I had her for 3 days, and I'd have signed anything. That's it. That's the whole reconciliation. 11 minutes, and then Ruth had to leave for work. Before we left, my mother took an envelope out of her purse, that month's, and she held it out and Ruth wouldn't take it. And my mother said, then throw it away. But I'm not taking it home. It's in the tote, unopened, with the other 370. If you've stayed with me this long, you're the reason I finally said all of this out loud, instead of keeping it in a box in a trunk. And if you want to hear the rest of what people do to each other in this family, and in others, go ahead and subscribe, because I'm not close to done telling these. Here's where it actually landed. I have coffee with Ruth on Tuesdays. It's been 4 years. We go to a Bob Evans off Harrison because she likes that the booths are big. We talk about her sons, who are 30 and 27, and who knew about me the whole time, which was its own thing to absorb. I don't call her mom. I've never called her anything. I've built about 200 sentences that get around it, and she's noticed, and she's never once said a word about it, and I think that's the single kindest thing anybody has ever done for me. I call my mother twice a week. I moved her into a 2-bedroom in Kettering. I take her to her appointments. There is a version of me that could have walked away from her, and I understand that woman completely, and I am not her, and some nights I lie there, and I don't know if that's love, or if it's just 34 years of practice. I have not forgiven her. I want to be clear. People keep waiting for me to say I forgave her. But I bring her soup, so you tell me what that is. The wedding album came in a heavy white box. It's on a shelf in our living room. Page 9 is the wide shot from the balcony, the processional, image 114. If you didn't know, you'd never see her. She's an out-of-focus gray shape past the last pew, half a pillar, hands near her chin. Mark's mother has been through that album probably a dozen times and has never asked. That's my mother in the 3rd row, in blue, facing forward. That's my father on my arm, 10 weeks from the end of his life, holding on to me, having just committed the only act of open rebellion of his entire marriage. And that's the woman who carried me, standing in a June coat 40 feet away, not sitting down, because I think she knew she wasn't going to be there long enough to be worth sitting. 3 people in one photograph who each believed they were the one protecting me. I've had 4 years to decide who was wrong, and I still can't do it. So I'm asking you, because you've been sitting with me this whole time. If you were my mother in 1992, 7 months in, holding a baby, with 2 you already buried and the paperwork on the table, do you make the call? Tell me in the comments what you would have done, because I've never met a single person who answers it fast.